Okay, so we are recording now, and we're so pleased to be here today to share information about the science of reading with all of you. And just a reminder that we're presenting 3 events today in our introductory science of reading series, starting respectively at 9 o'clock, 10:45, and 1 o'clock. If you're viewing more than one presentation live, you can either stay logged in or you can leave the meeting and then rejoin later with that same link that you have. Many of you did submit advanced questions, actually several hundred, so we don't have time to answer those all, but we'll try to answer as many as we can, plus questions that come to us today in the chat box. So we'll have a question and answer period at the end of each presentation for those people who are attending live, but then those questions and answers will not be included on the recordings. Remember that if you're attending live and you're requesting continuing education units, you have to stay logged in until the end of the question and answer period, because that's part of the 90-minute time frame. If you need a certificate of attendance for any reason, please go to the chat box or to the email that we sent yesterday and click on the link to the Google form and fill that out. You can just fill out one Google form for all of the sessions that you attend today. We have a box on there where you can select the presentations that you attended. So my name is Mary Newton. I am the president of Reading League Wisconsin, and I'll be presenting today along with my friend and colleague, Amy McGovern, who is our vice president. So we're going to take just a minute to introduce ourselves. So Amy, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm just making sure you can hear me well.
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. There's so many things you could be doing today, but you chose to be here, and we are so grateful for that. We know you are invested in the success of your students, regardless of how crazy this year is going to look, and we know it's going to look crazy. We do hope that you gain some valuable insights from our series today. As for me, I just started a new position as the Associate Director of School Improvement for CESA 9 in North Central Wisconsin. Those of you from Wisconsin will know what that means, but I will just share there are 12 CESAs in my state, and the role of a CESA is really to support the districts we serve in whatever capacity they need, which means we're staffed to support a wide range of needs. And in my case, I'll continue to be a reading specialist and to work collaboratively to provide professional learning in the area of literacy. I've been fortunate in my career to work with a very wide range of teachers and administrators, pre-kindergarten through high school, including English learners and special education staff and students. And I live right near where I work, so here I am in Tomahawk, Wisconsin. And I'm honored today to present with Mary Newton, the president of our chapter.
So my impetus to enter the field of reading in the year 2000 was this discovery that my youngest child has dyslexia. And that led me to eventually, after getting trained, to doing tutoring and training new tutors at the Children's Dyslexia Center in Milwaukee, and later in inner Milwaukee schools. I'm not a teacher by background. My prior careers seem a little strange. I was a corporate attorney and also co-founder of a nonprofit dance center. So I always appreciate presenting with people like Amy who have that essential classroom experience. My husband and I live in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, and we have 4 grown children. So let's get started. Our first presentation in this series is an overview of the science of reading. And we're going to first look at some definitions of that term. What does science of reading mean? And then we're going to consider 4 conceptual models of reading. And finally, we'll take a brief look at brain studies. So how much would you say you already know about these topics? We're going to push out a quick poll for you to answer. Amy, are you going to do that, or you want me to do the poll?
I can do it.
Okay. You should see this on your screen. If you don't, you might have to, if you're in full screen view, you might have to exit full screen view in order to see the poll. So I do see it up on the screen right now. And basically, we just want you to choose where you sit there. I see people responding, which is great. we're going to share these results when we're done with the polling. Okay, we've got about 10 more people out there if they want to log in and record their vote. Okay, Amy, do you want, I think we have
Okay.
90% in, so that's pretty good. You want to end the poll and we can share the
Yep.
results.
Oh, there's a few more people jumping in. I
Okay,
pause.
all right. Here they come, the latecomers. Okay.
Okay, well, I'm there.
All
All
right.
right, and I'll
Can you
share the
share the
results.
results on the
Yep,
screen?
there we go.
Okay, so we can see basically we have about a third just starting to learn about science of reading and about a third knowing some basics. So that's 2/3 of our group today right there. And then we have about a quarter who already have a pretty good grasp of theory and application. And then we have roughly 14% who really have been into science of reading in a deeper way and have more understanding. So hopefully, regardless of where you are there in your science of reading journey, you'll find something of interest today in this presentation. Okay, do you want to stop sharing the results, Amy?
I
And then
did.
we can move
I
back.
did stop sharing. It should be gone.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So these are the books that we've used as our primary resources in preparing this first presentation, and we would recommend any of them as great additions for a reading professional's library. The book by David Kilpatrick, the Essentials book, is really very accessible, and it has a lot of connections, direct connections to classroom or tutoring practice. Mark Seidenberg's book, Language at the Speed of Sight, is useful for exploring the science of reading in depth. It's a heavy book, so don't be put off by that. You just have to read it in small chunks. And FYI, we will be doing a book study on Mark Seidenberg's book online in October and November, so watch for an announcement of that. Stanislaus Dehaan's book contains all the details, probably more than you ever wanted to know about neuroscience and brain studies. And Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, as the title indicates, has information on dyslexia. So those were our 4 primary sources for today. So let's start out, if you want to flick the slide, Amy, thank you. Let's start out by defining the science of reading. Think for a moment to yourself, what comes to your mind when you hear that term? I think it's a term that's out there that people hear these days, but I think people have different conceptions of what it means. So what comes to your mind when you hear that term? As science of reading becomes more of an educational buzzword, I think we can safely bet that within a few years, all instructional materials, all assessments, professional development programs, they're all going to be labeled as aligned with science of reading. It probably won't be true, but they're all going to say that they're aligned with science of reading. Just like when the Common Core came out, all of a sudden you saw on top of everything a stamp that says aligned with Common Core. So the more we understand about the science of reading, the better consumers we will be of these materials. So let's start. If we're looking at a definition of reading science, I thought we should go first to a reading scientist for a definition. So let's look at a definition that comes from a reading researcher. This definition is based on writings by Mark Seidenberg, who is a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. The science of reading is an accumulated body of basic clinical and brain research. It's gathered from the United States and around the world, And it's what we consider settled science, even though it's continually expanded and refined. But replication is key in scientific studies, and you'll see that key details in the science have been proven true time and time again. So we should be especially skeptical of any claims that say something that's drastically different from what this converging evidence is showing us. The science of reading has been around for decades and has many contributing fields, including developmental psychology, linguistics, educational psychology, and the cognitive and neurosciences. Contrary to what you may have heard, the science of reading is not just about phonics. And finally, the science of reading has very important implications for helping children succeed in what is one of the most complex human behaviors, learning to read. Now we're going to take a look at the definition of science of reading from an educator's point of view. Stephanie Stoller, you can find her online. She has a presence online. She has a recording where she talks about science of reading. It really would make a great elevator speech if you are asked to, can you explain what science of reading is? Stephanie Stoller, this would make a great elevator speech. So Amy is we're going to watch this as a video, and Amy will turn that on at this point.
Whoops. There we go.
Hello.
We'll get it right.
Yep, we're coming.
And welcome. My name is Stephanie Stoller, and I would like to provide a very brief introduction to what is known as the science of reading. Reading isn't natural. No one is born a reader. Reading isn't a natural skill like talking or walking. Reading doesn't happen by osmosis, from being read to, or from being in a literacy-rich environment. So if a student seems to be struggling, we can't just wait and see. And there's no such thing as giving a student the gift of time. If we wait, some students may not get it. And if they don't have it by the end of first grade, they don't tend to catch up, even with typical intervention. This means directly teaching the skills that contribute to reading rather than taking the child's lead or assuming they will pick it up on their own will be more effective. Everyone learns to read in the same way. There aren't multiple ways to learn to read, so we don't need to match our approach to student preferences or learning styles. All skilled readers have phonics skills and age-appropriate language comprehension. There is a known path or reading circuit in the brains of skilled readers. Reading starts with oral language. The reading pathway relies on connecting speech sounds to print and to the meaning of words. Struggling readers and non-readers haven't yet established these connections and actually might use the wrong side of their brains when they try to read. Instruction can prevent or correct this. You can strengthen these pathways by basing reading instruction in language and reinforcing the speech to print connection, rather than relying on rote memorization, the visual features of printed words, or guessing based on context or pictures. Some students acquire these circuits or pathways more easily. Others need lots of repetition to create these pathways, but it is the same pathway. Some students will require careful, deliberate, distributed, and cumulative practice. Some students have brains that make learning to read very difficult, but with the right instruction, even students with reading disabilities, including dyslexia, can learn to read. All students benefit from explicit and systematic instruction in the skills that form the reading pathway. Students living in poverty, English learners, students with disabilities, even top-performing students benefit from explicit and systematic instruction in phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, listening, and reading comprehension. It is not too early to start intentional reading instruction in kindergarten, and it is never too late to teach the essential skills. The same instruction that works for preventing reading failure will work for remediating reading problems. Prevention is easier and cheaper than intervention. There are known indicators of reading that can be assessed in the beginning of kindergarten. Teaching these skills to students who don't have them can change the course of their lives. Although research hasn't answered all questions about reading, there are thousands of studies conducted over several decades that converge around how children learn to read, the most effective instructional practices, and what to do when students are struggling with reading. It is time to put what is known into practice in every classroom. If the science of reading is new to you, start exploring. There are a variety of ways to learn more. Peruse the websites of the Reading League or the Ohio Department of Education for excellent resources. Watch the Science of Reading webinars from Voyager Sopris Learning. Seek support from your local International Dyslexia Association branch or Decoding Dyslexia chapter. Read documents such as Teaching Reading is Rocket Science, Ohio's Plan to Improve Literacy, or Narrowing the Third Grade Reading Gap. Listen to Emily Hanford's podcasts. Engage in ongoing professional development, such as letters or the reading teacher's top 10 tools. Watch videos on YouTube from Stanislaus Dehaan, Lynn Stone, or Spelphabet. Follow Facebook pages such as The Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, or my page, Stephanie Stoller Consulting. Read books such as Speech to Print, Language is the Speed of Sight, or Explicit Instruction. In fact, reach out to your boss, administrator, or past university professor and offer to start a book club with one of these books so you can all learn together. Feel free to reach out to me at stephaniestaller@gmail.com or download my free Science of Reading materials at readingscienceacademy.com. Start where you are with what you have and do what you can starting today. There's no judgment. We've all been doing the best that we can. Now it's time to learn more so that we can do better for our students.
So if you want to go back and watch that video again, you can access it on Stephanie's YouTube channel, or you can just Google Stephanie Stoller. She has a website. She's got all kinds of things online, so you can find that again and watch it. I really thought it was quite succinct at getting the main points across. So now we have a general idea of what we mean by that term science of reading, both from the perspective of a reading researcher and the perspective of an educator. And the next thing that I want to point out is that the science of reading is built on and supports two fundamental truths. And if you don't carry anything else away from this presentation, I'd like you to remember these two fundamental truths because they will guide you into the rest of the science of reading. The first truth is that we were never born to read. Human speech evolved almost 2 million years ago, while the first writing systems were invented by humans only a few thousand years ago. Our brains simply are not hardwired to learn to read. We have to repurpose brain structures and networks that evolved for other purposes. The second truth is that the alphabetic principle is at the center of our alphabetic writing system. So our alphabet letters, our written system of English, represent speech sounds in spoken words in a predictable way. And the insight that letters represent speech sounds is called the alphabetic principle. For young children who are used to thinking of words in terms of the meaning they convey, this is often not very intuitive. Alphabetic writing systems contrast with logographic writing systems from places like ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, as well as current-day China, where written symbols in their language stand for concepts or words, not speech sounds. In this image, you can see the ways that the words fish, bird, axe, arrow, and bottle have been represented in those logographic writing systems. The Chinese writing system, and I find this fascinating, where symbols represent concepts, is the reason that people who speak Cantonese and people who speak Mandarin can read the same text and get its meaning, even though they can't understand each other's spoken languages. That's because the logographs represent concepts that they can both understand and relate to words in their respective spoken languages. It's similar to the way that we can follow picture signs in any airport in the world, guiding us to the baggage claim or the car rental or the restrooms, even though we don't speak that local language. So now we're moving on past the definitions and the fundamental truths, and we're going to start taking a look at some common models of reading, conceptual models that align with science. So you might wonder, why do we need conceptual models of reading? What purpose do they serve? Well, we may have a good body of knowledge about reading, but a conceptual model can take us to the next level by helping us organize that knowledge in our thoughts. It can help us organize our thoughts as we evaluate our students, as we prepare intervention plans, as we select assessments, as we build curriculum, and as we consider the pros and cons of various instructional programs. It can also help us reflect on the effectiveness of our practice and communicate with other educators and families who may not be as familiar with reading as we are. So we're going to take a look at these 4 conceptual models: the 5 components of reading, the simple view of reading, Scarborough's reading rope, and the 4-part processor. And I hope that at least one of these models will be helpful to you in your practice. So the first model that we're going to look at is the 5 components of reading. This came out of the report of the National Reading Panel in 2000. It's sometimes referred to as the 5 pillars of reading. And it's probably the most widely recognized scientific model of reading within education and within the general public, simply because it's been publicized. As you may have seen it pictured as 5 columns on the left, or you may have seen it pictured as 5 interlocking puzzle pieces showing these 5 components of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And these are, in fact, accurate descriptors of 5 things that are really important for reading. And in fact, we will see them again in the other 3 models. It's a good mental checklist for educators to make sure that they're touching on all the multilinguistic skills that go into reading. One of the drawbacks I find of the columns representation is that they give no indication that these components are interrelated in any way. And even the puzzle representation, which does imply that the 5 components are somehow connected, it doesn't explain how they're connected or how they need to work together for reading to develop. The other thing that bothers me about this model of reading is that the term comprehension is ambiguous. It could mean language comprehension, which could be oral speech comprehension, or it could be reading comprehension. It's not clear what comprehension refers to here. So Amy is going to describe the next model, which is the simple view of reading, and that is all about how these 5 components, how these different reading skills are in fact related.
So the simple view of reading was proposed by Philip Goff and William Tunmer in 1986. Since then, it has been verified by over 200 studies. It's an excellent example of settled science. It's written as mathematical formula that simply posits that reading comprehension, the ultimate goal of reading, is the product of decoding, or word recognition, and language comprehension. Decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. It's simple, but it's not simplistic. It's meant to be the big picture conceptual model that's filled in with additional information. In just a moment, we'll see how those 5 components of reading help flesh out the simple view. Notice that the simple view distinguishes between the 2 main domain skills that are necessary for reading comprehension. One of the main insights that this model conveys is that each domain in itself is necessary but not sufficient for skilled reading. Decoding refers to word-level reading, both the ability to sound out a word and the ability to store it in memory for instant retrieval, which is often referred to as word recognition. Things like phoneme awareness, letter names, and mapping speech to print are all included in the decoding factor of the equation. Language comprehension is sometimes referred to as a linguistic comprehension or listening comprehension. They all refer to the same thing. When we think of language comprehension, we think about background knowledge, vocabulary, reasoning skills, and critical thinking skills. Note that this model distinguishes between language comprehension, which is a factor in the equation, and reading comprehension, which is the product or outcome. This is something that was in fact ambiguous with the 5 components model. Language comprehension is our ability to process spoken language, and it contributes to reading comprehension. Remember that reading comprehension is always our outcome. Okay, hang on one. So note that the simple view of reading is a multiplication problem. It's not addition. So let's see how it plays out as we run a few scenarios for students who have varying levels of decoding skills and language comprehension, with 0 being little or no skill and 1 being robust accomplishment. So a student with no decoding skills and no language comprehension will, unsurprisingly, have 0 reading comprehension. 0 times 0 equals 0. A student with excellent decoding skills, but little or no language comprehension, 1 times 0, will also have 0 reading comprehension. We see that proficiency in one domain cannot bootstrap a lack of proficiency in the other. We often see this scenario play out with students who are learning English as a second language, although it can show up in native English speakers as well. They're proficient at decoding, but they simply do not understand what they read. Likewise, a student with the opposite profile, no decoding ability, but excellent language comprehension, 0 times 1, will also have 0 reading comprehension. Again, this could be a new reader who has yet to learn the alphabetic principle, or it could be an older reader struggling with dyslexia or some related word recognition problem. They can understand information in oral language, but they cannot get meaning from print due to their lack of decoding skills. This is quite common in the reading intervention world. A more typical situation is one where we have a student who has mediocre skills in both of those domains. So we'll say that's about a 0.5. And we might think this student should have reading comprehension at that same level of their decoding and their language. But running through the formula, we see that 0.5 decoding times 0.5 language comprehension equals only 0.25 reading comprehension. So weaknesses in both domains are multiplied when looking at reading comprehension outcomes. Likewise, a student with fairly good decoding and language comprehension, let's say about 0.75, might be expected to have reading comprehension at roughly the same level. However, again, we see that reading comprehension is dragged down by the deficits in both domains and rises only to 0.5625. Again, weaknesses in both exacerbate weaknesses in the outcome of reading. So reading comprehension is simply not proficient. Again, I'm sure you can picture a lot of students you've worked with that match that description. The only way a student can achieve optimum reading comprehension is if both to be proficient in both domains, decoding and language comprehension. This model has important implications as we plan instruction and intervention for a student with weak reading comprehension. We must not assume that the weak reading comprehension is caused only by language comprehension deficits or inadequate strategy instruction, which is where we often put the blame. Instead, we need to complete the appropriate screening and diagnostic assessments, which will inform us where those underlying weaknesses may lie. Only then can we design effective reading instruction. We know this is a lot to take in, so hang in there with us. We'll definitely get to questions. So as we mentioned earlier, the simple view is the big picture, needing to be filled in with all of this detail. We can begin to do that by mapping those 5 components onto the simple view. This also gives us more insights into how the 5 components are interrelated and what function each one of them serves. Phonemic awareness and phonics belong to the decoding domain of the simple view equation. Fluency straddles the 2 domains of the simple view. It's an observable characteristic of a reader who's moved from simply decoding to automatic word recognition. And it's also a facilitator of language comprehension by freeing up the cognitive space to apply those language comprehension skills when reading. So it's really not a thing we chase after, it's a byproduct of all the effective instruction that we give kids. Vocabulary clearly feeds into language comprehension. So completing this exercise makes us realize that the term comprehension, as used in the 5 components model, is really a bit ambiguous. What is reading comprehension? It could refer to skills that go into building the language comprehension domain, or it could refer to the outcome of reading comprehension. It alerts us to be quite precise with our language and ultimately precise with our instruction. So here's another way of showing the details with the 2 domains of the simple view. The blue boxes represent the decoding or word recognition domain, with phoneme awareness and letter sound knowledge developing separately initially and then combining in our decoding and phonics instruction. The final word recognition box represents robust reading, where most words are recognized automatically and effortlessly. It takes a lot of practice to get there. The green boxes represent the language comprehension domain, with background knowledge, vocabulary, and knowledge of text sentence structure combining to build that language comprehension piece. The 2 domains, word recognition and language comprehension, both contribute to the yellow box at the end. Reading comprehension is always the goal. So it's often helpful to categorize individual readers and classrooms of readers in a way that describes where their strengths and weaknesses lie, both for the educator's own information for instructional planning and to facilitate conversation with colleagues and parents. The 2 domains of the simple view of reading can help us do this. The x-axis on this image shows us our word recognition skills from poor to the left, proficient to the right. The y-axis measures language comprehension from poor at the bottom to proficient at the top. So think about your screening information that you take in the fall and how you could use this to help you categorize which box the kids fit into. A child with good word recognition and good language comprehension will be in that upper right quadrant, described as a good reader. Yay, that's where we want them all to be. If language comprehension is good, but word recognition is poor, you move to the upper left quadrant. These are the students with dyslexia or other word recognition problems, which may or may not be dyslexia. Good word recognition combined with poor language comprehension puts you in that lower right-hand quadrant of specific language comprehension disability, or hyperlexia. Many times in my career, I've had teachers say that they have a child who has language comprehension or language reading comprehension issues, when in fact, when we dig in deeper, we discover that what they have is undiagnosed decoding issues. It's worth noting that only about 5% of students are actually hyperlexic, although English language learner students may increase that percentage slightly since they are at least temporarily struggling to process spoken English. Even if they're proficient in their first language, they're not proficient at processing spoken English, and therefore they may look like they're in that hyperlexic category because they can read beautifully. I can read Spanish beautifully. I don't know what I'm saying, but I can read it. So there's a good example. Problems with word recognition and language comprehension classify you in that lower left as a student with mixed reading problems, sometimes referred to as garden variety poor readers. So think about your students and how they could map onto these quadrants. Okay, let's continue to flesh out the simple view beyond seeing how the 5 components map on. The closer we look, the more we can see that the simple view really isn't so simple. At different phases of reading development, decoding and language comprehension receive different weights in that D times LC equals RC formula. Beginning readers usually have enough language comprehension to understand the simple text that they're expected to read. If they have trouble, it's likely because they're not able to decode the words accurately. So the word recognition domain receives more weight in the formula in that early reading process. As readers mature in their word recognition, often around 3rd or 4th grade, the content of their reading material becomes more complex in information, structure, and design. Here, the simple view starts to shift to language comprehension carrying more weight in striving for that good reading comprehension. However, if students are not able to decode those big multisyllabic words with ease and accuracy, they will continue to struggle with their reading comprehension. As we climb the grades, the big words carry the meaning, so advanced decoding and encoding still need attention alongside language comprehension. But overall, as typical reading progress develops, we see that flat teeter-totter shift in the language comprehension slope. Decoding is in place, freeing up the brain for reading comprehension. Our next model addresses the sub-skills that are included in each domain of the simple view in more detail than we'll get by just mapping on the 5 components.
So this next model is Hollis Scarborough's reading rope. This was a game changer for me when I learned about this graphic. It provides details on those multiple skills that we didn't see in the simple view. Language comprehension is found in the top part of the rope, and word recognition or decoding is found in the bottom part of the rope. Under language comprehension, we have numerous sub-skills, including background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. And under word recognition, we see phonological awareness, decoding and spelling, and sight recognition of familiar words. A student becomes more strategic in thinking about the content of his reading as he matures. And that's represented by the arrow at the top. And a student becomes increasingly automatic in word recognition, as represented by the arrow at the bottom. So with sufficient mastery of all strands of the rope, top and bottom, the reader moves toward skilled reading, which is the fluent execution and coordination of both language comprehension and word recognition. Now, if we overlay the simple view onto the rope, we can see the 2 domains, decoding and language comprehension on the left, as well as the outcome of reading comprehension on the right. And you can also bring back that first model and search for the 5 components in the rope. So you can spot phoneme awareness and phonics, decoding and spelling, in the bottom word recognition strands. Vocabulary is in the upper language comprehension strands, and comprehension could refer either to the entire language comprehension part of the rope or the final outcome of skilled reading, because as we discussed earlier, the term comprehension in the 5 components is ambiguous. The only component from those 5 components of reading that we don't see actually named in the rope is fluency. And this led me to understand that fluency is not really a skill in and of itself. You have to be fluent at some task. And when we talk about reading, that task that we need to be fluent at is word recognition. So fluency is represented by that increasingly automatic arrow on the bottom of the word recognition strand. Fluency is simply the outward behavioral manifestation of the automaticity that's happening in the brain. So let's look at differences and interrelationships between the top and bottom parts of the rope. We're going to save an examination, a detailed examination of each individual strand for our next presentation today, but there are some differences between the top and bottom part of the rope that I want to point out. So Sharon Vaughn, who is a noted reading researcher from the Meadows Center at the University of Texas in Austin, she conceptualizes the top strands of the rope as knowledge of the world, and the bottom strands of the rope as knowledge of the word. Although they're both necessary for reading comprehension, these domains have some qualitative differences. Let's think about language comprehension first. Language comprehension is unconstrained. It continues to develop over your entire lifespan, and in all contexts, wherever you are. It develops formally with instruction, but it also often develops informally without explicit instruction. It develops in English language arts classes, of course, but also in other academic and non-academic classes and in experiential activities outside of school. On the other hand, developing word recognition skills is a finite task that's generally accomplished at the basic level by around 3rd grade. Yes, we do continue to delve more deeply into morphology and advanced decoding after that point, but decoding is pretty much in place by the end of 3rd grade. So generally speaking, the development of these skills is also dependent on explicit instruction in the English language arts block. It's not something that we tend to pick up on our own outside of school, and it's not something that we tend to pick up in an informal manner. We actually need formal instruction in this. So you'll note that these 2 domains in this model are separate in the beginning. The top of the rope does not touch the bottom of the rope. And the strands in each half of the rope are also separate in the beginning. They're not intertwined with each other. Until a child can adequately pull words off the page, they can't work on comprehension except through listening or experiential activities, including read aloud and discussion. Especially important to note is that the word recognition does not develop by using language comprehension abilities in the top part of the rope. We only have 3 strands under word recognition, and those strands are responsible for developing word recognition. We can't take the language comprehension skills and impose them on the bottom half of the rope to develop word recognition. So we are going to see some implications of that later when we discuss instruction that aligns with science of reading.
So this is our final model of the day, the 4-part processor that's adapted from the work of Seidenberg and McClelland in 1989. Before the advent of the brain imaging techniques, these 2 researchers used computational models to hypothesize about how the brain processes written words. They identified 4 brain areas or processors that work together when we read written text. This model explains how they interact. The orthographic processor analyzes the written symbols and word structure. In this case, we have the word bat, and it relates them to the speech sounds in the phonological processor, the at. This communication back and forth between the orthographic processor, which is the print, and the phonological processor, the sound, happens through our application of phonics. This communication, when we recognize the word recoded into speech as bat, it triggers a mental orthographic image in our meaning processor. Do we know the word bat in our vocabulary? Perhaps we know several meanings for this word, like that little flying mammal. Or maybe we think of the baseball player with the bat in his hand, or the action of hitting the ball with the bat. It's only until our context processor is activated that helps us sort through all of this information. And in this case, the sentence, Mary batted her eyelashes at Tom, gives us a new meaning for the word bat. The context processor communicates with the meaning processor to add this new meaning to our vocabulary file. As these processors fully actualize through instruction and practice, we ultimately instantly recognize most words without lengthy crosstalk between the orthographic and the phonological processors. Though this process still occurs, we really do see every letter of every word very quickly, instantaneously, once it's been coded into our brains. We continue to develop our meaning and context processors through experience and continued language use, both verbal and in print.
So those are our 4 models. We had the 5 components of reading, the simple view of reading, Scarborough's reading rope, and the 4-part processor. So now we're going to go on and we're going to look at what happens in the brain when we read. And in the process of doing that, we're going to see how accurate that 4-part processor really was. So with the advancement of brain imaging technology, we now know a lot about how reading develops that we just had to guess at before. We have the technologies of PET scans, fMRIs, and MEG, which is magnetoencephalography. It's like video imaging of what's going on in the brain. And these have all contributed to our understanding of how reading happens. Brain imaging studies from both adults and children, both good readers and poor readers, have been replicated for nearly 3 decades now. As described by Ken Pugh, who is the director of Haskins Lab at Yale, that's where they do a lot of this research, brain science seeks to answer these 3 big questions about reading. First, what are the brain circuits that we use for reading and how are they formed? Second, what differences do we see in the brains of good and poor readers or new and experienced readers? And finally, what interventions are effective in remodeling the brain toward a more typical reading circuitry, which then results in more proficient reading ability? So by combining observing live reading behaviors and being able to link them to brain activity, it provides us with powerful evidence of how the neural pathways are built in the brain. Through our conceptual models of reading, we've seen and can explain many of the skills and behaviors that are involved in reading. The 4-part processor in particular was a computational model hypothesizing what happens in the brain when we read. The phonological and orthographic processors interact to produce word recognition, and then the word activates the meaning processor and ultimately the context processor.
We love this quote from Stanislaus Dehaene, whom you will meet in a moment via the miracle of YouTube. I can remember saying many times in my career that there are many ways to learn to read, and I truly believed this at one time, but that simply isn't true. Now, that's not to say that children have different learning, that they don't have differences in the way they learn, that some kids need more or less practice on various subskills, because that is true. But we know with great certainty what the brain needs to learn in order to become a reader, and it's exciting and liberating to really own that understanding. Dehan is a cognitive psychologist and neuroscientist whose brain imaging work continues to inform our understanding of how we learn to read. If you wouldn't mind, let's read this all together. I know I can't hear you, but let's all just read it together. Here we go. It's simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. When it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints, the same learning sequence. So lots of good stuff there. Same brain, same learning sequence.
So we have a model coming from Stanislas Dehaene, who, by the way, is from France. And this is a model that he derived from the fMRI studies that they did at his lab. And it shows areas in the left hemisphere that are involved in reading. So that's the front of the brain on the left and the back of the brain on the right. You're looking at the left side of the brain. And as we saw in the 4-part processor, the eyes see the print and activate the visual input at the rear of the brain. So even though our eyes are here, the input, the visual input, comes way at the back of our brain. So that is represented in blue. And then if the word is known to us on a deep level, or orthographically mapped, if you will, we're going to be talking about orthographic mapping later, the visual word form area in red will activate and quickly process all the letters and sounds of that word and then move on to meaning making. But if the word is unknown, the phonological and orthographic processors need to interact with each other to identify the word. From the visual word form area, signals are sent forward in the brain to the meaning makers in green and the articulation and pronunciation centers in orange. So the blue and the red areas are really the entryway to process print, and they lead to the green and orange areas that are also used for speech. The yellow area represents our ability to monitor all this activity and make it run smoothly. So let's watch Dehaene explain this. And he has a very heavy French accent. So Amy, if you want to turn on the closed captions, it'll be helpful to everybody.
Yeah.
Do like this stone. This is very simply that reading starts as any other visual stimulation in these generic visual areas of the occipital pole of the brain, but then very quickly moves into an area that we have discovered, which concentrates the recognition of the written word. I have called it the brain's letterbox, because it is where we store our knowledge of letters. And from there, what you have seen is this explosion of activity into at least 2 networks, one that concerns the meaning of the words, and another that concerns the pronunciation and the articulation of the word. And so we can say essentially from the brain's point of view that learning to read consists first in recognizing the letters and how they combine into written words, and second, connecting them to these systems coding for speech sounds and for meaning. And what is rather remarkable is that all of the areas in orange and in green here already exist for spoken language. They are shared between spoken language and written language. So not only that, but they already exist in a young child. We can image the brain of young babies, even when they are extremely young, few months of age. We have various methods for that. And when we have them listen to language, we already see this network of regions which exist also in the adult brain and that process spoken language. So we may say that reading is not creating something completely novel. Reading consists essentially in connecting, creating an interface between vision and the language system, the spoken language system. When the child comes to the reading school, it already has a very sophisticated spoken language system. It already has a very sophisticated visual system, but it needs to create this interface, this visual word form area, this brain's letterbox, and to connect it appropriately. And in doing so, it needs also to change some of these target systems.
Okay, and one of the things that I find interesting is that the research that Dahan does in France, it's reflected and mirrored in research that we do here and research that's done in other countries. That everybody's seeing the same things regardless of where they are and what language they're studying in, as long as they're studying an alphabetic language. So to recap from his video clip, we have these images from Nadine Gabb. She is from at Harvard. She has her own reading lab there. And she shows the same areas of the brain on the left. And then she also has a slide that shows the networks that connect them on the right. So reading problems can originate in any one of these areas and often in more than one area. And so in future presentations, not part of this particular series, we will dig into assessments that highlight potential areas of strength and weakness, along with instructional work associated with building those essential neural pathways. And so if all this is new to you, please take some time to reflect and process, because we know it's a lot to take in. Amy, I think I just stole your slide there, so I'll let you
That's
go
okay.
back to the next one.
Okay, so one of the main findings of brain imaging is that the reading circuits in the brain do not exist in their entirety before learning to read. Although we are born with that desire to understand and to be understood. According to Steven Pinker, spoken language in the typically developing child is hardwired and has been since humans first walked the earth. But written language must be bolted on. Whoops, sorry, I lost my slide. Written language must be bolted on, and if you will, it has to be developed through a lot of practice. Written language and the ability to read is not part of our biological wiring, at least not yet. Oh, and here's a shameful plug for our next session. We will dig into those developmental phases of reading when we analyze Scarborough's reading rope in session 2.
Okay, so on the next slide, we have another finding of brain imaging that's really remarkable. It shows how plastic the brain is in responding to intervention instruction that's targeted to a student's specific reading problems. So children with dyslexia or word recognition problems show underactivation in that left hemisphere, the part of the brain that needs to be active for reading. And particularly in the posterior areas and right in back of the ear here, dyslexic brains are underactivated there. And at the same time, they compensate in the right hemisphere, trying to make up for what's not happening on the left. The problem is the right hemisphere is not an efficient area to use for language processing. But the good news is all of this can be changed with appropriate intervention. So here we see the results of remediation in the brains of 2 dyslexic students, one on the left and one on the right. So we're showing multiple images for each of those students. The images for each student show the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, both before treatment and after treatment. So the pre-treatment left and right hemisphere is shown on the top for each student, and they show that underactivation in the critical left hemisphere areas, and they show the overactivation compensation in the right hemisphere areas. After treatment, on the bottom set of slides, we see that their brains more closely resemble a typically developing reading brain, working primarily now in the left hemisphere, with reduced activity in the right hemisphere. And another exciting finding from these studies is that the remodeling of the brain actually continues after intervention stops. So it's like if we get it started and get the brain going down the right pathway, it can continue to remodel itself in a more typical way. So this is really super exciting stuff to know about. And you can really consider reading teachers, if they understand the science, reading teachers can be brain engineers. They can help form and remodel the brains of their students. But you can't use just any kind of instruction or any intensity of intervention. These particular results in this study were achieved with 80 hours of phonologically based reading intervention over 2 months. So that's about 2 hours a day of one-on-one intensive intervention in code-based, sound-based reading instruction.
And just to comment that that seems daunting, because I know we have a lot of classroom teachers in our audience right now. And you think, well, I can't do 2 hours of one-on-one code-based instruction. So we're going to talk about at some point in our third presentation what that looks like in the classroom. Okay, carrying on. So in this next image, fMRIs give us static pictures of the brain that allow us to identify areas and pathways that are critical for reading. If you've ever had an MRI done, you know that you have to lie perfectly still as the machine images your body or your body part. The F in fMRI stands for functional. So in the case of fMR reading studies, the subject is reading text in the machine, and the machine is measuring the iron that moves in freshly oxygenated blood as the areas of the brain are activated while the subject reads the text. The next brain imaging advancement, MEG, magnetoencephalography, has been able to show us the video version of brain imaging that demonstrates the time sequence of brain activation. So unlike those fMRI images, the MEG images can be taken while the head is moving, and they are far more precise than fMRIs. Here you see a time-lapse image derived from MEG imaging during reading. The input starts in the rear of the brain in a different place than speech, which is in the far left. It then moves to that letterbox region for word identification, and then on to the rest of the brain centers that are shared with speech processing. It's interesting to note that even when reading silently, the speech centers of the brain are activated. And it's also worth noting that these processes happen extremely fast. So let's check in again with Dehen to see real-time MEG video of the brain lighting up as a person reads. Watch that same back to front movement that we've been talking about this whole time and that you just saw in those stop image, action image, stop images. Okay, I can talk. Here we go.
The reading school, it's already has a very sophisticated spoken language system. It already has a very sophisticated visual system, but it needs to create this interface, this visual word form area, this brain's letterbox, and to connect it appropriately. And in doing so, it needs also to change some of these target systems. How does this work exactly? We've conducted a large number of studies, and many other labs in the world have conducted many studies that look at what has been changed in the brain of children or adults after they've learned to read. And in particular, I want to mention here a study that we did very recently, which was published in the journal Science, where thanks to a large international collaboration, we were able to scan illiterate and literate subjects of various levels of literacy in Brazil as well as in Portugal, bringing them to our lab in France. Thanks to this experiment, we managed to make a complete map of the areas that have been changed by learning to read. And as all of you in this room know how to read, you can consider that your brain has been dramatically changed. So I've told you about these areas for language. The first major change that we see in the literate brain is this letterbox area coming active only in people who have learned to read. It will.
I think we're in the wrong spot.
I think if we start at 256, we'll be able to see. We'll be able to see that.
There we go.
I don't know why he just didn't do this in the order that we wanted to talk about it.
Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. We're going to try that again. Here we go.
Today, I want to talk specifically about the topic of reading and what we understand about it from the brain's point of view. If you had not learned to read, any page of text would look to you like this stone, a texture, but no meaning. But because you've learned to read, you can have a conversation with the deceased. You can speak to the dead. You can listen to the dead with your eyes because you can read what they wrote 2,000 years ago. You can communicate thoughts to the mind through the eye, which is the great invention of the world, according to Lincoln. So how does that work? Well, this is a picture of your left hemisphere. The left hemisphere of the brain is most essential for language and reading. And just to orient you, this is the back of the brain, this is the front of the brain. It's been slightly inflated so you can see inside the folds. And now I want to show you the activation of the brain as you read one word. We see it in time. So let me start this. Here we go. And you have the word unfolding from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. It will loop several times. You can see the information enters into the occipital pole, which is the visual side of the brain, moves into the ventral areas, and then explodes into the left hemisphere distributed activity. I have no time, of course, to explain to you all of the details of this brain activity, but I want to show you a sort of caricature that you can remember. And this very simply.
We showed you that caricature. He's about to explain it again. So we're going to stop there. And all right. Okay, so as we can see that the areas of the brain involved in reading that were hypothesized in that 4-part processor model have in fact been confirmed by fMRI scans, and the temporal sequence of the activation has been confirmed again by all imaging studies using magnetoencephalography, or MEG for short. The science has confirmed that contrary to some claims, we do not start with the context or meaning and then proceed to recognize the word. We start by connecting the letters to their speech sounds in a reciprocal process. Once the word is identified, we cannot help but to activate the meaning of that word if it's in our oral vocabulary. That's important. Which is then further confirmed or built upon through the context processors as we continue to read. This 4-part processor model was developed by was developed before many of those brain imaging techniques, but really has truly been validated by all of them.
So this really concludes the major content of this first presentation in our introductory Science of Reading series. But please stay on with us because we want to go through several slides where we show many resources that we tapped into for this session and that we can suggest to you for further study. And then following that, we have about 20 minutes left in this session, and we're going to be doing questions and answers. So we do have some questions that were submitted in advance, and we'll be checking the chat box. And remember, if you're going to claim continuing education units for live attendance, you have to stay logged in through the Q&A session, which will be over at 10:30. And for those of you watching in recording, note that we're not recording the Q&A, so you won't be seeing that on your screen. You remember or perhaps you don't know, but the mission of the Reading League, the National Reading League, and our chapter and other state chapters is to advance the awareness, the understanding, and the use of evidence-aligned reading instruction in schools. In session 2, which is coming up at 10:45, we'll dig into the developmental sequence of reading as set out in Linnea Airy's Phases of Reading, and then we'll layer that information onto Scarborough's Reading Road. All this content lays the groundwork for the first 2 parts of our mission statement, the awareness and the understanding of reading science. In our last session today, we will begin to explore the use of that evidence in providing evidence-aligned reading instruction. So please keep in mind that all of these sessions are just simply springboards into more learning. Amy and I have really been neck deep in science of reading for many years, and we still continue to learn and grow and challenge ourselves. We learn new things every day, as does everyone who's invested in doing this important work on behalf of our children. So here are some of the resources that we've used, and we suggest that you explore on your own, and they're arranged by topic, with the first one being general information about the science of reading. And these links have all been shared with you in the PDF handout. And the PDF handout, you got that link in your email yesterday, and it's in the chat box. So you will have access to look at this information. Emily Hanford has produced a series of audio documentaries on reading that are thoroughly researched and really very informative. And in fact, Emily's reporting is one of the main reasons that science of reading is such a hot topic today. Reading researchers, of course, are interested in it, educators are interested in it, but it really took a journalist to ignite this conversation. So we highly recommend her first 3 podcasts, and she has her 4th podcast coming up later this week, which focuses on comprehension. Here are some resources that look at 2 of the conceptual models of reading, the reading rope and the 4-part processor. And on the next slide, we have resources that explain the brain science behind reading more thoroughly. This is a mixture. We do have some books in here. We have Stanislaus Dehaene, Reading in the Brain, and we have Sally Shaywitz, Overcoming Dyslexia. But we have a lot of videos in here, because I think it's, is this a complex area? None of us are cognitive neuroscientists, so sometimes seeing a video is helpful. And then on the next slide, we have a group of books that we think would make excellent additions to the Reading Teacher's Library. You'll see that the books that we used as our primary sources today are all in here, but there are additional books as well. Marilyn Adams' book, Beginning to Read, was published way back in 1990, and it's still relevant today. And Speech to Print by Louisa Moats, combined with Adams' book, it makes 2 excellent companion books to get you started. Louisa Moats' book is now in its 3rd edition, so if you're looking to purchase that, I would get the most recent edition. Anita Archer's book on explicit instruction provides practical advice on how to teach through a science of reading lens, as does Wiley Blevins' book, A Fresh Look at Phonics. That's not pictured here, but is very helpful. If vocabulary and words are your thing, then check out Bringing Words to Life by Isabel Beck, and The Logic of English, and Unlocking Literacy. All of these books will support your vocabulary instruction as well as your ability to teach spelling effectively. So for more information on reading research, including information on dyslexia, you can read Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, Proust and the Squid, Reading in the Brain, Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, and Language at the Speed of Sight. That last book, Language at the Speed of Sight by Mark Seidenberg, has a whole section on dyslexia. That's one of his specialty areas. And finally, Natalie Wexler has her book, The Knowledge Gap, and that addresses the profound issues that we have building readers who can comprehend both language and text. Her book provides a case study of 2 different types of reading classrooms in the primary grades, and it's very interesting and enlightening read that may help those of you who are searching for curriculum to narrow your options. So I want you to stay in touch with us. If you're leaving us after this presentation, stay in touch with Reading League Wisconsin so that you are aware of when we're having upcoming presentations. We're always excited to share information with you wherever you are in your science of reading journey. So this ends the recorded part of this presentation. And for those of you who are attending live now, please stay online and we will have our question and answer